This is the last sermon of this series, My Not So Perfect Family. I made a post this week about something in our particular family. I mentioned that we're kind of a loud family. Really, everything we do is loud. So our new house has speakers throughout the house. And so I can grab my iPhone at any given moment and play whatever I want, as loud as I want, all throughout the house. And so that's how we wake the kids up every morning, usually AC/DC, something, is that what y'all do? Something just get the blood flowing, No, we play a little Jesus music in the morning, try to soften them up. It doesn't work at all. They still wake up in terrible moods, but just some things that we're trying to do because our family isn't perfect. Yours isn't either. I also asked some of you if you'd be willing to share some photos, maybe of your not so perfect family. I got a few that I'm going to share. The first one is the Center family. You guys know them, Brian and Pam. This one, I think we caught Pam in the middle. I don't know if she approved the sending of this picture, but I don't know what exactly she was saying, but they seem to be having a pretty good time there. We got another one from the Graffino family, and I don't know if you can make this out really well, but Michael seems to be having a good time, but I'm not sure about everybody else. And so this one was sent in, and that one's pretty good. That's pretty fun. We got another one because I know we've talked a lot about families, talked a lot about children, those kind of relationships. But we also, in the church, we have lots of different age demographics. We have some empty nesters. And so Alan and Mary Thompson sent us a picture of this is what a family photo looks like for a couple of empty nesters. And 1, 2, 3, I count 6 dogs there. And so you guys know and love them. Thank you so much for sharing those photos. And then a few years ago, we went on a vacation, which was one of the more memorable ones for us. We went to a place just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, and spent a week. We had a blast. Kids got to ride horses and all kinds of stuff like that. And one particular day, they were having a competition down at the lake where you could build a cardboard box boat. And so this was the big thing. And so Jackson, our oldest, was all about that. He said, we got to go down there. We got to build it. So we signed up. We went down there and we built the boat. And it was not very seaworthy. Somehow he managed to win this little derby. When it was all said and done, he had his blue ribbon. And we asked the lady in charge to take a picture of our family so we could remember the moment. And she took 6 pictures. And this is the best one that she got. If you look in the corner down here, you can kind of see Will. He's not even looking at her. This was literally the best picture she got, but we've got her fingerprints though. So if we ever need to track her down, I think we could probably use that. That works right on CSI as long as they get a photo of the fingerprint. And so we got 6 great shots of her finger. And so we remember that trip. It was a magical thing. And so, but we started this series looking at the Picture Perfect family. If you were a part of that, or if you've been able to go online and watch that first message, or what we also call the New Testament ideal. And in that New Testament ideal, it talked about a few things. It talked about wives submitting to husbands, husbands loving their wives sacrificially, and it talked about children obeying their parents, all of us, no matter our age, honoring our mother and father. It talked about fathers and how they're supposed to raise their children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Raise them to love Jesus, not just be a domineering influence in their life. So don't just irritate them, but actually raise them up. And we realize that for most of us, there's a pretty good gap between our reality and the ideal. Or you can think about this, there's a gap between the real and the ideal. And sometimes we can look at that gap and we can lose hope. We can actually say, well, man, I'm never going to be that. And so in that very first message, what we looked at was that we either can embrace that ideal and say, hey, we know there's a gap, let's try to close the gap, or we can redefine the terms. We can kind of change the rules so that we feel better about it. So what I want to do as we finish up this series is I want to circle back to a few things we looked at in that first message and go a little deeper, and then a few others that we've touched on along the way. So after part 2 of this series, it was called The Family That Fights. After that one and the first one, I heard several men in the lobby, and they said, Carrie, we noticed you didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about that passage that says that wives should submit to their husbands. And so they were kind of gigging me about that. We noticed you didn't spend a whole lot of time on that, this or that. And I joked in that moment, that's a whole message by itself. Ha, 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 we all yucked it up. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a whole message on submission. We're going to come back to that idea Okay? But before we do that, men in the room, can you do something with me? Let's look at that passage we're talking about, Ephesians 5:22, if you remember. If you want to go there in your Bible, you can. It's also on the screen. And here's what it says. It says, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And all the men said, amen. Right? Let's do one more thing, though. I want you to read that first word with me. Switch to the next slide. Notice what that first word is. Can we say it together, men, on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Wives. Now, the reason why the first word of this particular verse is wives, men, is because it's not written to you. It's not up to you to quote this verse. It's not actually even for you. It's for your wife. So if we're going to talk about submission, let's not start with verse 22. Let's start with verse 21. Throw that up. Verse 21 simply says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, if we were going to do an entire message about submission, we wouldn't focus on verse 22. We would start with verse 21. Because if we just focus on this idea of wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord, we will miss that submission is the overarching teaching of what is going on here. Actually, all of these family dynamics are going to come down to this idea of submission. And truthfully, if we're going to close out this series this way, I think if we were to miss out on that teaching, we would miss out on one of the most helpful things, not just in our relationship with our spouses and inside our own homes, but in every relationship that we have. And that idea is this one of mutual submission. Everybody submitting to everybody. In other words, all followers of Jesus, here's the big idea: mutual submission is the key to closing the gap between your real life and the ideal life that you see painted for you throughout these passages. It is submission, mutual submission. So what Paul does here is he goes on to apply this verse 21 of submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He applies it to each of the situations. He works his way down through these different relationships. And he just so happens to start with wives. And so hear it this way: everyone submit to everyone. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then it goes like this: for wives, that looks like this: submit to your husband the way the church submits to Christ. That's what it looks like. That's what mutual submission looks like for a wife. You're going to submit to your husband's leadership the way, as the church, we submit to the leadership of Jesus. Then he says this: for husbands, submission looks like this: loving your wife sacrificially and laying it down the way Jesus laid his life down for the church. That's what submission looks like. He keeps going. He says, children, submission for you looks like obeying your parents. He keeps going. Fathers, submission for you looks like, in submitting to your children even, is submitting the fact that you could be the one in control, the domineering influence, the harsh one, or you could say, rather than trying to get something out of them, I'm going to get something for them. I want to raise them in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. It all comes back to mutual submission. But regardless of the application, whether it's to wives, to husbands, to children, he keeps going. If you keep reading there in Ephesians chapter 6, where we were, he talks about other types of relationships, and it all comes down to submitting. And when we do, it looks different in those different situations. But there is no more of a command for a wife to submit to her husband than there is for the husband to submit to his wife. That's why it's always in our relationships and in our families, you before me. Paul and Peter take the teachings of Jesus and the example of Jesus, and they show us how it works in family relationships and really in all relationships. Jesus came and he redefined the family relationships. He was the one who was consistently saying, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this. You've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I tell you, don't even look at a woman with lust in your heart. He was always taking the accepted standard and taking it to another level. And he looked at family relationships and he showed them a higher standard, the law of love. And love is what drives us in our relationships. Wouldn't we like to all admit that and say that's true? We'd like to say, yeah, it's love. Love is the reason. Love is what keeps our family going. But love looks like submission. It's about you before me. So when Paul puts these commands before us, he doesn't just say everyone to submit to everyone. He doesn't just say submit to one another. He puts it in a context. And notice what that context is. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I'm just going to tell you right now, if he hadn't put the out of reverence for Christ part on there, we would struggle a whole lot more with this. And the reason is that because sometimes the one another's aren't worthy of our submission, are they? Sometimes that husband isn't worth submitting to. His character, his lifestyle, he's not worthy of your submission. Sometimes that wife isn't worthy. Sometimes those parents aren't worthy. Sometimes in our relationships, and I would actually go so far as to say most of the time, the other person, that one another, isn't worthy of the submission. So we don't do it for them. We do it out of reverence for Christ. We submit what we could have, what we deserve, what is right in that moment. We submit it out of reverence for Christ because that's what he did for us. He submitted what was right, that he was the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the creator of all. He submitted himself and came down because the one another's aren't always worthy, are they? So how do we do it? Well, I've got a few things for you. If you're taking notes, there's some notes there in your worship bulletin this morning. We submit because Jesus Christ set the example of submission. He set the example. Philippians 2, 5-8 says this, adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity. And when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Have that attitude. That, I'm going to tell you right now, that attitude in your family life, in your home situation, in your marriage, that attitude will close the gap between your real and the ideal. I can guarantee it. Even though he was God, even though he was the creator, even though he submitted himself and he humbled himself. Humbled himself to become like you and me. Humbled himself even further to die for you. And even further than that, to die a humiliating death on the cross. What is the attitude? It's an attitude of humility, an attitude of submission. Go to John 13. Not literally, but just in your mind. In John 13, it says that Jesus has this moment where it says that he knows, okay, that all power and authority has been given to him. He knows that, okay? It's like Jesus has this aha moment. He realizes that in his flesh, fully God, fully man, all power and authority are given to him. And what is the very next thing that he does? He takes off his robe, he puts a towel on his arm, and he begins to wash the feet of his disciples. In the moment where he realized and knew he had all of the power, all of the authority, all of the righteousness, it was all in him. In that moment, his first choice was submission and humility. I don't think we necessarily respond that way, do we? Think of the last argument you won. In the moment where you knew you had them, you had closed this argument. Was your first instinct humility? Or, no, I'm right. And you're going to acknowledge that I'm right. He set the example of having all the power, all the authority, all the righteousness, and humbling himself to serve them. That's submission. We submit because Jesus set the example. Here's another thing. When we submit, we invite opportunity. We invite opportunity. Philippians 2:4, right before that. It says, everyone should look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. So it says that. It says everyone should look out not his own interests, but the interests of others. And then it says the reason you do that is because you have the attitude that Jesus had. of submission. We invite opportunity. This isn't about being nosy. I'm not just concerned with what's going on with me. I'm concerned with what's going on. It's not about being nosy. It's about being concerned. This is the mentality that looks for opportunities to help. In our homes, is that our first instinct? That in our relationships, we are looking for opportunities to be helpful to the other person. Is that where we begin? This kind of attitude, this attitude of mutual submission says, in this situation, how can I use my position, my power, my abilities to show love? How can I do that? Even in the midst of maybe conflict or turmoil or an argument where you know you're right, in that moment you have a choice. Will I anchor everything on my rightness, on my position, or will I say, from the position where I am right now, what could I do to help them? Husbands, is that our instinct in our home? To look for an opportunity to help? To be helpful? When we submit, we invite opportunity. There's something amazing that happens. And it may not happen the first time, but when you just simply look at someone and say, how can I help? Honestly, guys, if we were to go home today in the midst of a situation and look at our wife and say, how can I help you? After she picks herself up off the floor, she might actually tell you what you could do to be helpful. I've found so many times that the ways I think I'm being helpful aren't actually, that it's the way I want to be helpful that way, but it's not actually what they need. You know what I'm talking about? You know, what she really needed was that both trash cans were completely full and they were crammed. That's what she needed. But what I thought would be really helpful is to go rearrange the garage. I'm just being helpful. I'm trying to get my tools in order. You know, if that's, how can I help? And yeah, when you ask, how can I help, eventually they're going to tell you. And maybe that's why we don't ask, right? But what if the reality is that we're living, maybe even unknowingly, in home environments where people on the other side who need our help are afraid to ask? Because when they do, we sigh. When they do, we grumble and complain. And we don't submit. In this situation, how can who I am and what God's called me to do and my abilities, my position, my power, how can I show love? How can I be helpful? And here's another thing. When you look for opportunities to help, you reorient your world. It takes our focus off of ourselves and off of our needs and off of our desires and our wants. It puts it on someone else. Galatians 5:13 says, "For you were called to be free, brothers and sisters, only don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but to serve one another through love." No matter what situation you're in, you can use your position, you can use your power, you can use your rightness for your own desires, or you can use it to serve others. And it reorients our world because it makes it not about us. Our natural instinct is to use our freedom and our situations to please ourselves, but we've been called to use it for others. It reorients our world. And here's the last thing I have for you. Happiness in your family always looks like mutual submission. It's like the recipe for it. If you want to know what a real harmonious household looks like, it's a household, it's a family where everyone is submitting to everyone else. No one is just looking out for their own interests. So much so that when someone does, it throws such a wrinkle into the family dynamic that everyone else is like, what is going on with this person? They're suddenly so self-absorbed. And even in that moment, everyone else still looks and goes, they must need my help. What can I do to help? How can I help them? They don't even see this about themselves. It always looks like mutual submission. The truth is you can have control or you can have happiness, but you can't have both. You can be right every time, Or you can have harmony in your home, but you can't have both. You have to submit yourself to the other person. This is the overarching teaching of all of this. Everything we looked at in the previous three, it begins with this idea that I'm going to put you before me in this situation. And the way it works, like in a couple, in a husband and wife, is that if I'm putting you before me and you're putting me before you, I don't have to worry about my needs because you're taking care of me. And you don't have to worry about your needs because I'm helping to take care of you. And I'm trusting you and you're trusting me. And I'm using all the giftedness that God's given me, and even my position as a husband and as a father, I'm using that to serve those in my family. Jesus is the one that set the example of this. He's the one who had all power, all authority. He is the ultimate leader. And his first leadership lesson was to wash the feet of his disciples, to humble himself, but literally before them in a physical way. The reason I'm telling you that, men in the room, is because you don't have to worry about losing your position and your status. You don't have to worry about losing your leadership in the home by submitting yourself and serving. It's actually the opposite that happens. When you look for ways to be helpful to your wife and to your children, to serve them, your position actually rises. The level of trust in your home rises. The gap between your reality and the ideal that God has for you closes when we submit. Happiness in your family always looks like mutual submission. You can say it this way: harmony in your family always looks like mutual submission. Success in your family, progress in your family. Romans 15:3, for even Christ didn't live to please himself. And I think that's probably our sticking point in most of our relationships, where we're struggling, where it's difficult, is that we are approaching them based on what we can get out of them, rather than God has put me in this situation because I have something that I can do here, something that I can give here. That means, ladies, that God intends for your husband to be a gift to you. Man, I go all the way back and I look at Adam in the garden, and he had all the position, he had all the power. Literally, the animals of the earth are coming before them. He's giving out names. Yeah, you look like a zebra. You look like a giraffe. He's giving out names, okay? This is an amazing position he is in. But yet, the God of all, the creator of all things, looked down and said, but he's alone. He needs help. It's not good that he would be alone. And so he brought his mate. And the plan was that he would help her and she would help him. As kids came along, they would help them. Do you understand that, fathers, that command that we don't irritate or exasperate our children, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition? If you go King James, the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, how many men are known as nurturers? We don't put that on our bio. It's not in our resume, right? Very nurturing. People are like, what does that even mean? Why would you? That's not what we're called to nurture our children in their love of the Lord. I'm going to tell you this: you don't nurture a little one without putting yourself down on their level and humbling yourself and submitting yourself to them. So what I'm teaching this morning is not anything earth-shattering, nothing new. It's ancient, okay? And it's incredibly simple, but it's oh so hard, because it means that for your family to be successful and harmonious and to make progress and for you to close the gap, you're going to have to approach your relationships and realize that it's not about you. It's about them. In my house, my relationship with my wife, it's not about me. It's you before me. And how drastically different would your house look and feel and sound if your first instinct in every situation was to simply look and say, how can I help you? And eventually to actually mean it. How can I help you? That's my challenge for you today. To take this truth of everyone submitting to everyone, submit yourselves to one another, and realize he may not be worth it, she may not be worth it, those little ones, they're acting like jerks today, they're not worthy of it. Children out there, if there's a verse that gets quoted a lot, it's probably wives submit to your husbands. If there's a second one, it's fathers don't irritate your children. Several teenagers have been quoting that to their dads this week. Again, what is the first word of that particular verse? It's written to fathers, not teenagers, okay? You don't need to quote it to them. Understand this. What does submission look like? It looks like honor and respect. It looks like laying my life down for my wife. For wives, it looks like submitting to your husband's leadership. The same way the church submits to the leadership of Jesus. And it's hard, but what if we this week walked into our homes, walked into our relationships, even walked into our places of work and said, how can I help you? How might it change things?